Hi, everybody. It's Jeff from Ayala Tours, and since 1986, we've been connecting people to Israel and the Jewish world. Professor Berk, we have reached this, our fifth session in this virtual series on the Holocaust Revisited. I know we have a lot to cover this evening, and I'll remind you that we had a couple people that asked questions in the middle of the week. So once we get to the Q&A, we'll get to that, including some questions about recommended books and some other things along those lines. But before we get to all of that, of course, we've got the formal presentation. So reminder to everybody out there, we do want you to participate. Please post your questions in the Q&A. It is a recorded session. If you need a copy of it, you can contact myself, or even better, my colleague Lisa at ayelet.com, and she can get you the access link for the private YouTube recording. Just one other note for people in general, if you ever have trouble where you've misplaced the link to this program, and of course, if you're watching this right now, you didn't have that problem, but it's always better to email. Email me rather than try to call, because then I can just respond to the email with the link, and it makes it much easier that way. Okay, I think that's it for right now. Professor Berk, I will turn it over to you for this, our fifth installment in our five-part series on the Holocaust Revisited.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much. And thank all of you for tuning in and for staying the course for the 5 lectures. We're going to talk, for the most part in this lecture, we're going to talk about 2 men, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Pope Pius XII. These are one of the more controversial issues of the Holocaust. Where were not the participants, what were the people outside, the allegedly good people, FDR and Pope Pius XII? I'll start with President Roosevelt. Now, if you made a choice of who were the 3 greatest American presidents, it would be Washington and Lincoln, or Lincoln and Washington, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be easily the 3rd. If you're collecting Social Security, you can thank Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you put your money in a bank that is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, you can thank Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a magnificent leader of our country during the Depression. Those fireside chats calmed the American people. That first 100 days, the banks closing, and remember, how do you put, I mean, what price can you put on a president getting up 25% unemployment, banks are failing by the hundreds each week, and the President of the United States in his inaugural speech says, "My fellow Americans, we have nothing to fear but fear itself." That's powerful stuff. He got us through the Depression, and he was a magnificent war leader. He didn't micromanage, and when he intervened, he made the right decisions. The most important one was delaying the Second Front. The General Staff of the United States Army, or the United States Military Forces, wanted to invade Hitler's fortress Europe really in the fall of 1942. That would have been a catastrophe. Then they shifted to the spring of 1943. That would have been a catastrophe. Roosevelt and Churchill made the right call. Don't invade France. Don't invade Hitler's fortress Europe until we knock the Luftwaffe out of the sky, knocked out German forces on the periphery, knocked out their oil and industrial installations. That was the right call. But, and here, as Elie Wiesel said, there's always a but. When it came to the Jews, he did not do what possibly could have been done. This is hypothetical history. He could have done more. We will talk about that in a moment. As we look back on this, there used to be an old joke from the 30s and the 40s. American Jews lived in 3 worlds. And the answer, of course, was always in Yiddish. Die Welt, this world. American Jews were concerned about this world. Some American Jews were concerned about Jene Welt, the world to come. But they all loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who received probably, without exaggeration, probably over 90% of the Jewish vote. But yet on the life and death issue of bringing Jews into the United States, Jews who wanted to flee first Germany, then Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then German-occupied Europe, Roosevelt wasn't there. The figure that we have is probably about 120,000 German and Austrian Jews came into our country between 33 and 41. And that's not chopped liver. That's a sizable number of people. In addition to that, in the middle of the 1930s, Roosevelt ordered the State Department to scour Europe for the best and the brightest. And some of the best and the brightest were Jews. Marc Chagall, for example, will come. Einstein will come. Others will come to the United States. There can be no discussion of American intellectual history in the post-Second World War period unless you factor in these people. These Jews who are coming, some of them that are picked by the State Department, helped by Varian Fry, a decent man, a non-Jewish man in France, operating for a private organization, is going to bring over a number of very, very prominent Jews from Europe that will enhance American intellectual life, really in some ways down to the present time. But he could have done more. There were times the quota was not filled. Now, I must talk to you about, and I mentioned this to you in another context. Roosevelt is operating under tremendous pressure and tremendous restrictions. Please note, you cannot let explication become exoneration. It's for the individual as we look at that, for the student of history. Could he have done more? Why didn't he do more? The pressures were great, the restrictions were great. Could he have gotten around them? Let me begin by talking about the restrictions. In 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. Before World War I, over 1 million people would come into our country each year. After 1924, it's 168,000. Then the increase of probably to about 250,000. But there's a qualitative nature to Johnson-Reed, and that is we don't want Slavs, we don't want Italians, we don't want Asians, and we don't want Africans. So what's going to happen? We want the Irish, we want the Germans, we want the Scandinavians. There's no Jewish quota in Johnson-Reed. But when you begin to give really low quotas for East European countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, then you've got yourself a problem as far as the Jews are concerned. Now, why is this the case? And the answer is that Americans have a long tradition of xenophobia. They don't like foreigners. And a number of Americans are beginning to say, we've got to prevent decline. An author by the name of Madison Grant wrote a book, and the thrust of the book was, who made America great? Grant said. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They're the ones that made America great. And he began to talk about the dilution of the blood pool, what we would say the gene pool, the coming of Africans, the coming of Jews, the coming of Slavs, the coming of Italians. This will weaken the spirit, the vitality of the American people. And therefore, you've got to keep these people out. So Roosevelt has to deal with immigration quotas. He also has to deal with rising anti-Semitism. We are concerned today about anti-Semitism. I can tell you in the 30s, it was much worse. Anti-Semitism is always a problem for the Jews when it is endorsed by affluent and very influential people. The only time in the history of our republic when prominent people, influential and very, in one case, very, very wealthy people, really endorsed anti-Semitism, the Jews are in for trouble. This is the time of Henry Ford. This is the time of Charles Lindbergh. This is the time of Father Coughlin in Detroit. Father Coughlin was the first radio priest. He'll speak to millions of people on Sunday night. He'll talk about the Jew deal. He'll talk about how the Jews are responsible for capitalism and for communism and all these things. Anti-Semitism was alive and well in American society. And so the point is, Roosevelt's got to somehow encounter that. He's going to encounter that. He's got to deal with that. In addition to that, remember, we're in the time of the Depression. At the nadir of the Depression, 25 to 30% of the American workforce is unemployed. Nobody wants foreigners in because the belief is they'll take away the jobs from hardworking, decent Americans. And given the anti-Semitism, sure as hell you don't want Jewish immigrants coming into the country. And there was something else, something that should have worked for the Jews, for immigration, but it doesn't. There was a good deal of sympathy for Jews living in German-occupied Europe, and particularly in Germany and Austria before the war. But then people began to worry about German sabotage efforts. And the argument was raised, even though by people who were sympathetic to the Jews, the argument was raised, out of every 100 German Jews coming to the country, 5 are members of the Gestapo. And of course, there was a fear. There was a fear of German sabotage. We know that during the war, a German submarine off of Long Island landed a number of German saboteurs who were supposed to go to the Jersey Shore and blow up the oil installations on the Jersey Shore. So there was a real fear here. But nonetheless, there were things that could have been done. The quotas are there, but some countries, the quotas were never filled. Roosevelt could have filled those quotas. He could have done that, but he didn't do it. Or he could have, let us say, once the war began, I'll put it another way. Napoleon was reputed to have said, money is the artery of war. Money is often the artery of Jewish survival. Money could have been smuggled into Europe, to the underground organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish organizations. That money could have been used to pay Gentiles to shelter Jews. Everything is in short supply. Money is in short supply. Food is in short supply. Fuel is in short supply. If you pass money into Europe, that the argument against it, it'll get into German hands. But even if it got into German hands, so what? Some of the money, it wasn't a large sum of money for the Germans in the scheme of the whole, if you look at the whole war effort. So it's a few $1 million going to do. But for the Jews who are hiding out, the Jews who are hiding out, being sheltered by Poles, by Czechs, by Slovaks, by Ukrainians, it may have made a difference. And once again, remember, we're not talking about chopped liver here. We're talking about human beings. Roosevelt could have pressured other countries, given them inducements in order to take in Jews. Let me be clear here. There was no way in the world that Franklin Delano Roosevelt could have saved 6 million Jews. No way in the world could that have been done. But again, we're not talking about animals. We're not talking about, commodities. We're talking about human beings. And Roosevelt could have, if he used the Oval Office as a bully pulpit, told the American people what was happening and told them it is, if we want to be true to American values, America's always been a place of asylum. We should take in these people. Once again, I'm saying to you, no way could Roosevelt have taken in 6 million people, not a chance in the world. He could have done something else. He could have bridled the American State Department. The State Department was a den of anti-Semites. The most notorious was a man by the name of Breckinridge Long. Long was a high-ranking diplomat. He was also a contributor. He was a Democrat. He was a contributor to Roosevelt's election campaigns. And he Breckinridge Long thwarted, again, Jewish immigrants. He increased the burdens. You had to show proof of certain things. You had to have a sponsor in the United States that had a certain sum of money. And the orders went out from the State Department to treat people in Germany, Jews who were lining up at the American consulate, the American embassies, stall them, make life difficult for them. These are people who really we don't need in America. These are people who don't have the same values as we have. Their ethics are not the same. Roosevelt could have fired Breckinridge Long. If you want to read, the 2 books that I think are the best that deal with this, one is the historical book that I use in class, The Abandonment of the Jews by David Wyman. The Abandonment of the Jews by David Wyman. There are other books. I think Wyman still is the best. If you want to read a superbly written book, a book that reads like a novel but is not a novel, it's not as well researched as Wyman's book is, but it makes the point very, very well. That's Eric Lawson's book, In the Garden of the Beast. That's a discussion, very well written, very interesting book, about the first American ambassador, Ambassador Dodd, to Germany when Hitler became chancellor. Dodd was a professor of history at the University of Chicago. He has some relationship with Roosevelt. Roosevelt plucks him out of the University of Chicago and sends him, and he's not particularly fond, Dodd, he's not particularly fond of the Jews. He sends him to Berlin. Now, the interesting thing here, and of course what is so interesting to some of my students, Dodd had a daughter. The daughter sleeps around with Nazi officials, but she brings information to Dodd. And Dodd, who started out not being very sympathetic to the Jews, becomes very, very sympathetic to the Jews because of what she's telling him and what he sees in the flesh. That is what he sees, Jews being beaten up on the streets, is there at the time of the Nuremberg racial laws. He becomes very sympathetic. And then we come to the issue of Roosevelt himself. I discuss Roosevelt's actions. What was going on in the man's mind? Was he an anti-Semite? I've taught history at Union for 57 years. I've taught the Holocaust for about 40 to 45 years. I never made the point, because I didn't believe it was true, that Roosevelt was an anti-Semite. I argued that Roosevelt was under great pressure. He wanted to solve the Depression, put the unemployed back to work. Roosevelt always talked about the forgotten man, and Roosevelt was preparing our country for war. I never thought anti-Semitism would play a role in any of his decision-making. But the historian Raphael Medoff wrote a book entitled The Jews Should Be Silent. The book is an interesting book. He gets a lot of Roosevelt's private correspondence, looks at it, and looks at what some of the people who spoke to Roosevelt, what they are saying Roosevelt said to them. I wouldn't say it's hard to say this. Was he an anti-Semite? Certainly not a hardcore racial anti-Semite. But some of the things that he wrote about in private correspondence, and some of the things that he spoke to people about, are problematic. On one occasion, writing that maybe the Jews are responsible for the anti-Semitism in Poland and Germany. Maybe they contributed because of their behavior. Things like that. And it's bothersome. Now, the question for the historian is, one, did he really say these things, feel this way? And the answer is he probably did. Did it have an impact upon his decision-making? That's the tricky stuff for the historian. Does he not fill quotas? Does he not shift quotas around? Does he not use the Oval Office as a bully pulpit because he's lukewarm at the very best on the Jews and maybe a little bit hostile to the Jews? Or are those other pressures there? Remember, he's got the Solid South. At that time, the Solid South, the Democrat Party dominated the South. And he doesn't move on black issues either. Black leaders in our country pleaded with Roosevelt. They pleaded with Eleanor. Eleanor pleaded with her husband. He wouldn't give her the right time on this issue. What black leaders wanted, Eleanor Roosevelt wanted, and Jewish civil rights leaders wanted, was a federal anti-lynch law bill. There will be no federal anti-lynch law bill because he doesn't want to sacrifice votes in the Democratic South. So the point here is he's under great pressure. He has his own goals, and he doesn't want to squander political capital in behalf of the Jews. Now, every analogy I've told you repeatedly, every analogy is flawed. I'm going to give you a flawed analogy, but I hope it makes the point to you. Do you remember after Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992? This was the time when bad stuff was going on in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia. Bosnia, Muslims were raped, Croatians were raped, a very difficult time. And everybody said, oh, we're going to intervene. Elie Wiesel won the Nobel Prize. Wiesel never won the Nobel Prize for literature. He should have, but he never won it. He won it for peace because he went to the former Yugoslavia, came back and reported to President Clinton. And in a famous expression, he said to Clinton, Mr. President, I've been there. I know what genocide is about. And I'm telling you, this is the thrust of what he's saying, I'm telling you it's taking place in the former Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia. And American public opinion was calling for this, that we should intervene. And the newspapers, the people on television, radio were saying we're going to intervene. We didn't intervene for 3 or 4 years. And the reason we didn't, maybe, again, because what was written on the Democratic Party headquarters. It's the economy, stupid, James Carville said. You want to win the election? You want to be re-elected in 1996? Don't squander political capital on the Balkans. get the economy right. That's the problem. That's the problem, I must tell you, in the entire history of the Holocaust. That's one of the asymmetries in the Holocaust. For the Nazis and for Adolf Hitler in particular, the murder of Jews took precedence over almost anything else. You could even make a case. There were occasions he was more concerned about making the Europe Judenrein clean of Jews than he was of winning the war. For the Nazi, here's the asymmetry. For the Nazi leadership, Adolf Hitler in particular, the murder of Jews was of the greatest importance. For those on the other side, those who wanted to help the Jews, the issue was, as in the case of Roosevelt, make sure the New Deal continues, help the forgotten man, prepare the country for war. On the pro-Jewish side, nobody's going to move heaven and earth to save the Jews. There are always other issues involved. That's the asymmetry, and that's the problem with Roosevelt. I'll give you another example. In 1943, in the midst of the war, Joseph Goebbels, a real son of a bitch, the Nazi propaganda minister, gets on Nazi radio and says that a German reconnaissance patrol operating in Belarus, not far from Smolensk, and in the Katyn forest, German soldiers have come across mass graves in which there are Polish officers, the remains of Polish officers are there, and they all have a bullet in the back of their neck. There are thousands of these Polish officers. Then he goes on to say that German forensic pathologists examining the bodies said that these men were killed sometime in the spring or summer of 1940. The Germans didn't invade the Soviet Union until June 22nd, 1941. So if they were killed sometime in 1940, somebody else had to do it. And the answer, of course, was, in reality, the truth is, they were killed by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, on Stalin's orders. When news of the killing, again, in 43, when Goebbels makes that statement, Polish Americans get very, very upset. They demand from Roosevelt that when he goes to Yalta, or even before that, when he goes to Yalta, when he goes to other conferences and meets with Roosevelt and Churchill, goes to Tehran, again, Tehran first, then Yalta, when he goes to these places and the big three meet, that Roosevelt should raise the issue. Roosevelt did raise the issue once. Stalin blasted him, in effect saying, what are you giving this crap for? This is, of course, Nazi propaganda. Why don't you fight a little bit harder? Where's your long-delayed second front? My people are losing tens of thousands of men each day, and you're diddling around there in North Africa and Sicily. When are you going to invade France? Roosevelt and later Truman will never raise the issue. After the war, when the Cold War begins, and Congress gets into the business of investigating what happened at Katyn, the answer is true. Goebbels, for once, was telling the truth. That is, there were thousands upon thousands of Polish officers, including some Jews. For those who have come with me to Warsaw on one of the IALA trips, or who will be coming with me on this trip that we're going in late June and early July, in Warsaw, there's a memorial. It's a cart, a wagon, filled with crosses and filled with an occasional Jewish star. Jews were not allowed to be officers in the regular Polish army. That's Polish anti-Semitism. But in the reserves, Jewish doctors and Jewish college graduates, university graduates, Jewish lawyers, they could be reserve officers. And when everybody was mobilized in 1939, the reserves are mobilized, and the Soviets take thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Polish prisoners of war. They're going to execute some of them, the officers. So there are Jews that die at Katyn too. Again, for the Jewish people, at least for some of them, if not maybe most of them, saving Jews was of primary importance. But for the rest of the American people, it was not. It simply was not. So, how do you rate Roosevelt? The third greatest president of the United States. A man who gave us the safety net, a man who gave us Social Security, a man who secured our banks, a magnificent war leader, as I said to you before, a magnificent leader of our country during the Depression. There's an adage, an old statement. Does it apply to Roosevelt? Think about what I've said, do some of the reading, and here's the adage, and you tell me if it's true. You think of whether it's true. In the warmest of hearts, there's a cold spot for the Jews. In the warmest of hearts, there's a cold spot for the Jews. Now I move from Roosevelt to Pope Pius XII, the man who is the Pope from March of 1939 to 1953, a crucial 14 years. Let's cut to the chase again, very, very quickly. History towers over the present like a mountain. I've said that to you a number of times before. The history of the Roman Catholic Church is not one, here's an understatement, is not one of great sympathy for the Jews. The church, the early Catholic Church, competed with Jews for converts, and the church is going to teach what a historian almost 2,000 years later is going to call the basic teachings of contempt. Teaching number one, Jews at the time of the appearance of Jesus on the historical scene were spiritually bankrupt. The Jews worshiped the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. The Jews are only interested in material things. The story in the New Testament about Jesus chasing the money changers out of the temple, that epitomizes that type of thinking. Remember, I said to you before, Jews had to be money changers in the vicinity of the temple because Jews from all over the diaspora are coming to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. That's what the temple is for, to expiate sin. They got to buy animals. They got to change their currency into the currency of Judea. That's where their money changes. But the greatest charge of them all, remember, the Jews are, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, down until the early 1960s, Jews are guilty of the greatest crime that has ever been perpetrated on this planet. They killed the Son of God. And then teaching number three, the idea that the covenants between the Jews and God, they're abrogated because the Jews killed Jesus. And God now has a new chosen people, those who accept Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. The new Christians, the new religious faith, the new religious ideology. These are the people that are now chosen by God. So there's hostility there. And there's a mythology about the Jews. Jews with tails, Jews with horns, Jews with long penises, all that kind of stuff. And again, that mythology, the Jews kill Christians, Christian children to bake the unleavened bread, take the blood from the dead Christian kids and put it in the matzah. Nonsense. But perception is reality. Or the myth of host desecration, that when no one is looking, Jews go into Catholic churches, take out the consecrated wafers, which according to the Catholic tradition, that's called transubstantiation. When the priest says a prayer over the wafer becomes the body of Christ. We went over this in the first lecture. And then if this is not bad enough, in the more modern period, as the church looks at the world, as the Roman Catholic Church and many non-Catholic Christians look at the world, the primary enemy of Western civilization, the primary enemy of Christianity, are not the Nazis. They're the communists. The Nazis believed in God. At least they said they did. The Nazis went to church. The Nazis believed in the sanctity of private property, but not the communists. Not the communists. What is true is when the Bolsheviks or communists came to power, remember I'm using the term Bolshevik and communist interchangeably because they can be interchanged. They're one and the same. In October of 1917, when the Bolsheviks came to power, they burned the churches to the ground. They crucified Russian Orthodox priests on the church walls. They took away church land. They took away all the gold and silver in the churches. A good Marxist Leninist is hostile to the church, is hostile to God, doesn't believe that God exists. So the point here is, as the Roman Catholic Church looks at the world, Nazism is bad. The church was not oblivious. The Nazis closed out the Catholic youth movements. They put pressure on the Catholic schools. They took crucifixes out of the non-Catholic schools and so all sorts of things. And Pope Pius XII was no dummy. He was a very smart man. He knew that the Nazis were a threat. And obviously, remember, they have to be a threat in the sense that Nazis had to look on Christianity with a great deal of suspicion. How good could Christianity be if Jesus was a Jew, Mary was a Jew, Joseph was a Jew, all the apostles were Jews? How good could Christianity be? But Hitler was shrewd enough. You don't mount a frontal attack on the Catholic Church. But in their heart of hearts, as they used to say in the 19th century, the Nazis really had a problem with Christianity. But in the eyes of the Vatican, as bad as the Nazis are, the communists are worse, and the Third Reich is a buffer, a bulwark against communist expansion into all of Europe. Then we come to the personality of Pope Pius XII. He was a Germanophile. He liked the Germans. He was a papal nuncio to Germany. And in fact, he's the engineer of the Vatican Accords that are done. The Nazis actually signed an agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, giving the Nazi state and giving Adolf Hitler a good deal of legitimacy. Anybody who stops communism in Germany and outside of Germany will receive the support of the Roman Catholic Church. And this man, this is the Concordat. That's what it is called, in the early 1930s, after the Nazis come to power. That is the work of Eugenio Pacelli. That's Pope Pius's real name. That's the name he has before he becomes Pope. So this man, a very, very smart man, is a Germanophile, a ferocious opponent of communism, and plays everything close to the vest. Does not want to jeopardize in any way possible the lives of Catholics and the property and whatever possessions that the Roman Catholic Church has, both in Italy and elsewhere. So when Benito Mussolini institutes in 1938 and 1939 the racial discriminatory laws against the Jews, up until the end of the 30s, Mussolini in the 20s, you could consider him a philo-Semite. He says some very nice things about the Jews. And the Jews respond. There were about 45,000 Jews, 40,000, let's say, in the 1920s. Are you aware of the fact 10,000 of the 40,000 Jews were members of the Fascist Party? 10% of the Grand Fascist Council were composed of Jews. Wealthy Jews and middle-class Jews, fearing communism, looked at Benito Mussolini as the man who was going to save them from a communist upsurge in Italy. So, but with the passage of time, the only country that draws near to Mussolini, because of his anti-democratic actions in Italy, the crushing of the opposition, the execution of some of his opponents, Mussolini draws very close to Hitler. And Mussolini begins to institute anti-Semitic legislation. Jews are expelled from the universities. Jews are expelled from the army. Jews were expelled from the civil service. Jewish property was taken. No pogroms, no concentration camps, but the position of the Jews in Italy, beginning in 1938 and 39, is very, very difficult. Pope Pius XII does not issue any condemnation, no condemnation whatsoever, of the racial policies, the anti-Semitic racial policies of Benito Mussolini's government. His predecessor, Pope Pius XI, had tried to pressure Mussolini to stop not even to initiate anti-Semitic legislation. And in a very famous papal encyclical, all papal encyclicals they're known by the first three words. Pope Pius XI issued in the second half of the 1930s a papal encyclical entitled Mit brennender Sorge, with burning pity, with burning sorrow. He condemned Nazi racism, said racism is anti-Christian, anti-Catholic. He did not condemn anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, but he said Nazi racism. But he was so appalled by what was happening in Germany, he had a relationship with a Jesuit priest from is brought over, and they write another encyclical. This is the so-called hidden encyclical, which condemned anti-Semitism, but it never saw the light of day because he died. And Pope Pius XII, who replaced Pope Pius XI, would never publish the encyclical. So there we are at the end of the 30s. What's going to happen is not Italian racial anti-Semitism grows, very difficult, not an impossible time, no physical violence. If you would like to take a history through film, I'll give you a golden oldie. Some of you may have seen it early on, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, The Garden of the Finzi Cantinis. The Garden of the Finzi Cantinis. And then there's A Beautiful Life. That's the film, somewhat comical film. People opposed it because how do you make comedy out of the Holocaust? But the Italian actor was magnificent. And you get a sense of the noose tightening around Jewish lives in this period of time. Throughout the war, even in the period of the racial decrees by Mussolini in 1938-39, the only rise you get out of Pope Pius XII is a concern for baptized Jews. Those Jews who had converted, and there were thousands of them, some Italian Jews, for whatever the reason may be, converted to Roman Catholicism. And Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, for sure, begin to argue to Benito Mussolini, these people should not be considered as Jews. They were baptized. They are good Catholics. And one of those ironies, that is, the Catholic Church's view of Catholicism in terms of conversion is not really dissimilar from what is in the case of the Jews. Remember, when somebody converts to Judaism, we are told we are never to remind that person that he was a convert. There should be no murmuring in the synagogue, no lashon hara, no gossip about this person who was a convert. You convert to Judaism, you are a Jew. Now, the Orthodox will say it's got to be a halakha conversion. In the eyes, again, of most Jews, someone who's converted to Judaism is considered to be a Jew. And in the case of Italy and Pope Pius, these are the only things he's concerned about. The Jew qua Jew, he doesn't give a damn about. But Jews who are converted, baptized Jews, he is very concerned with. And then there's the issue of mixed marriages. What happens if you have a Catholic woman married to a Jewish man and they have children? In the eyes of the Nazis, these children would be Mischlingen, people of mixed blood. Not a good thing to be in Nazi Germany. Not a good thing at all. But the Pope Pius XII intervenes here, talks about, and maybe exerts some pressure on Mussolini's government. And listen to the solution they come up with. If it's a Catholic woman that was married to a Jew and they had a child, the official position of the church was this Catholic woman, this child was born of an adulterous affair between a Catholic woman and a Catholic man. That the Jewish husband, is not the biological father of the child. So the child is not a Mischlinger. He's not one of mixed blood. He's a bona fide Catholic Italian. Strange, but that's the position. The apocalypse begins to descend upon Italian Jewry in the late summer and early autumn of 1943. There were several 100,000 German soldiers in the northern part of Italy when Mussolini was the dictator. But Mussolini is overthrown in a military coup because a number of Italian generals believe the jig is up. We got to pull out of the war. We'll be destroyed if we fight. Germany's going to lose the war, and we're going to pay a price for it. So secret feelers are held out to the Allies, and Italy pulls out of the war. Mussolini is overthrown. Italy pulls out of the war, and Italy enters the war on the Allied side. This the Germans cannot tolerate. They can't do it because you can go through northern Italy into German territory. Germany cannot allow Italy to move into the ranks of the Allies. Cannot do it. So those several hundred German soldiers shoot down the Italian peninsula And in the middle of October of 1943, they occupy Rome. They had not occupied Rome before. Now they are in Rome. And the orders from Berlin come to SS commanders in Rome, round up the Jews for deportation. And thousands of Roman Jews are put on trains and sent to Auschwitz, and they'll be dead by nightfall. The Pope says nothing about this. He says nothing. When he begins to intervene, he is told that a number of baptized Jews were in the roundups and they're on the trains. Then he intervenes, trying to save those baptized Jews from deportation. They're already on the trains. He can't get them out. There are only a few cases. A number of baptized Jews were rounded up, put on the trains, sent to Auschwitz, and murdered. But, again, a few are actually taken off the trains before they depart. But here's the basic point. Pope Pius XII doesn't intervene to save the Jews, makes no public statements. And in private audiences between the German ambassador Weizsäcker and the Cardinal Mangione, the church doesn't raise the issue of saving Jews. And again, it is fair to say that the Roman Catholic Church couldn't have saved large numbers of Jews. But once again, forgive me for using the cliche. This is not chopped liver we're talking about. The papacy could have saved some of these people, stopped some of the deportation, slowed them down. But it didn't. It didn't do anything. The best historian, German historian on the German occupation of Italy, is going to make the point. Throughout the war and throughout October of 1943, the Pope's only concern was for baptized Jews. Beyond Italy, between 39 and 45, there is no papal condemnation of the Holocaust. None whatsoever. What is he afraid of? Why doesn't he do it? Was he a hardcore anti-Semite? He probably has some traditional ideas about the Jews. He's certainly not a racial anti-Semite. Is this why he keeps quiet? Maybe. But he's got other concerns. Now, most of us are secular people, very secular people. You're going to laugh at what I tell you, but you shouldn't laugh. Because for religious people, including religious Catholics, it means something. What the Pope was probably afraid of was a schism within the Roman Catholic Church. If he speaks out against the Nazis, two things can happen. One, does he weaken the Nazi war effort against the communists, against the Soviet Union? He doesn't want to do that. The other is, if he condemns what the Nazis are doing against the Jews, you can rest assured that Hitler would have told German Catholics, about 40% of the population of Germany, he would have told them, pay no attention to him. And Hitler would, in fact, have probably created a schismatic church, a German Catholic church. Why do I say don't laugh? The Pope is concerned about the immortal souls of these people. A lapsed Catholic is not a good Christian. A lapsed Catholic is going to go to hell. And the Pope doesn't want that. He also doesn't want destruction of private property, Catholic private property. Doesn't want pressure placed upon priests and nuns, doesn't want that. He worries that maybe the Germans will invade the Vatican City and take him prisoner and take lots of Catholics as prisoners. He certainly doesn't want that either. So for a variety of reasons, the Pope is not going to speak out. But again, I say to you, never let explication become exoneration. He could have spoken out, but he's faced with a problem that we all face in our lives. That is, how do you confront evil when there's a price to pay? It's very easy to confront evil and to oppose evil when there's no price to pay. I tell my students, you didn't like President Biden, you sign a petition. You don't like President Trump, you get thousands of signatures and you pass them on to the White House. You bring them to the newspapers. Will I throw you out of class? Will I give you a failing grade if you take a political position? The answer is no. Will Union College throw you out? The answer is no. It's no problem to oppose evil here. This is a democratic country. No matter what's going on at the present time, this is still a democratic country. You stand up and oppose the Nazis on issue X or issue Y or issue Z, you may end up in Dachau. Or even worse, you may end up in Auschwitz. So the Pope is concerned. He's concerned about German Catholics and Catholics outside of Germany and the rest of Europe. And remember, again, I'm telling you, the Pope's primary concern is for baptized Jews. And the Germans, for the most part, are not really arresting and deporting baptized Jews. In some cases they do, but in many cases they will be sheltered, or they'll be able to escape in one way or another. What the Pope worries about is that if he condemns the Nazis, what they're doing to the Jews, the Nazis will take it out on the baptized Jews. And that, of course, as we've said repeatedly, that's something that the Pope doesn't want. But again, I come back to what I said to you when we talked about Roosevelt. Don't let explication become exoneration. The Pope could have spoken out. Would it have led to those terrible things? After all, what is the Pope? In the eyes of the Catholic Church, the Pope is the vicar of Christ, the representative of Jesus Christ on this planet. Or to put it, and I'm not being sarcastic here, believe me, I'm not being sarcastic. What would Jesus have done? The Pope is the vicar, the representative of Jesus on this planet. If Jesus came again, Jesus the Jew, would Jesus have supported the Nazis? Would Jesus have remained silent while his own people were being deported? I doubt it. Again, there's a price to pay for resisting evil. And the Pope apparently did not want to pay that price. What would have happened if the Pope did in fact speak out? Now that's a very interesting issue here. Very interesting. Word was coming from Europe that the Jews were being exterminated. People didn't believe it. When does information become knowledge? A lot of it has to do with British atrocity propaganda in World War I. The news of what the Germans were doing to the Jews came through the BBC, came through British publications. In World War I, the British lied through their teeth. They talked about German atrocities and all this, they rape and they kill nurses. They didn't do that. The Germans were not Vestal virgins, but they didn't behave. German soldiers did not behave in World War I as German soldiers behaved in World War II. And so, when the war is over and Americans begin to regret entering the war, and the country on the war and hunting returned to normalcy, people begin to argue, should we have entered the war? And many people think, down to the present day, we were suckered into the war by British atrocity propaganda. And to a certain extent, we were. The point I'm trying to make to you is, when the first news comes and it comes through the Brits, the initial response is not to believe it. But had the Pope spoken out, again, one of the most important people on this planet, if the Pope speaks out and says, yes, it is indeed true that the Germans are killing the Jews, maybe more people would have believed it. Maybe more work to save Jews would have been done. Maybe more Jews would have gone into hiding. Maybe more Christians would have been willing to welcome Jews and shelter them, even at the risk of death. We don't know that. We will never, never know it. So the failure of the Pope to speak out goes beyond, again, it's not limited to any particular area, to Italy or anywhere else. In France and in Hungary, when the Germans with collaborators begin to round up the Jews, there are a number of Catholic prelates in both France and in Hungary. Should we oppose this? Should we help the Jews? Should we try to delay it? And the answer that comes back again and again and again is the Pope has remained silent. He's not condemning what is happening. Are we more papish or popish than the Pope himself? That's why a number of Catholic clerics do not speak out. The Pope is their leader. He's a vicar of Christ, and he does not condemning this. So why should we speak out? The Pope must have a reason for not speaking out. And there were no orders from the Vatican City to cardinals and bishops to support the Jews or to condemn the Nazis. The only one that I know of during the war was the Archbishop of Toulouse, Archbishop Salège, who got up in the altar and said what the Germans are doing, what Vichy France, the collaborationist government in France, is doing. It's anti-Christian. It's not the right thing to do. And explicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly, he's calling upon the Catholics in Toulouse, French Catholics, to come to the aid of the Jews. But that's a rarity here during the Holocaust. Now, the Pope doesn't cover himself with glory after the war either, on two specific issues. One we're clear on, the other is a matter of debate. When the war was over, it is found out by Jewish organizations that thousands of Jewish children and teenagers have been hidden by their parents in churches, in Roman Catholic churches. Infants, parents, Jewish parents, seeing that the apocalypse was going to dawn or come down upon them, begged their Christian neighbors and begged local Catholic priests, take in the infant. They did. Thousands of Jews were saved in this way. But these kids, some of them, not all, some of them were baptized. Some of them were baptized into the Catholic faith. So the question comes after the war. Most of the Jewish parents of these kids were killed by the Nazis. Most of them were killed. But some of them were not. They come back to get their kids. And even in the cases where parents, again, the parents were killed, there were relatives who survived. They want to claim these children for their families and for the Jewish people. And the Pope makes it clear that any kid or any infant that was converted, was baptized, should not be returned to a Jewish family. And then something else. Here, we're in a difficult place because we don't have the definitive evidence here. Thousands of Nazis and collaborators from Lithuania, from Croatia, from a whole host of places were able to escape Germany and to escape Europe and find refuge in Latin America, in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay in particular. How did they get there? This is what is known as the Rat Line. The Rat Line was a group of people because of their anti-communism, because of their anti-Semitism, because of their belief that these soldiers that are trying to get out were on the front line of saving Christian civilization from these terrible communists and these Red Army soldiers. So they will provide fleeing Germans with passports and money and at least temporarily lodging. And will they make contacts with Juan Perón in Argentina, with other Latin American leaders? We believe that the center of the Rat Line was a Croatian seminary, a Catholic seminary. Croatia was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. The Croatians were hell on wheels in dealing with the Jews during the war. There was even a Croatian concentration camp called Jasenovac, in which several 100,000 Serbs and Jews were murdered. In fact, again, I don't want to spin this out. There was a Roman Catholic priest, a Franciscan, who was participating in the murder of Jews in Jasenovac. And the inmates referred to him as Fra Santana, Brother Satan. So, again, the church doesn't say a word during the Holocaust, doesn't protest the racial decrees. Pope Pius XII is responsible for this. After the war, he doesn't call upon monasteries and nunneries and churches to return the Jewish kids to either their parents or to their relatives. He doesn't do any of that. Now, when it comes to the Rat Line, It is that Croatian Catholic Church, Croatian seminary in the Holy City, the Vatican, in Vatican City. Did the Pope know about this? We know that individual Catholic priests provided fleeing Nazis with what they needed to have a start in Latin America. We know that. That's incontrovertible. Did the Pope know it? Did he support it? That to this day remains an open issue. This is not a glorious chapter in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. I didn't mean to bash Roman Catholicism or the Roman Catholic Church. There were priests and there were good Catholics in Poland and in Italy and elsewhere who sheltered Jews at the risk of their lives. There were thousands of priests in Dachau and other concentration camps, and a number of priests in Auschwitz, Polish Catholic priests. They went up the chimney too with the Jews. So there should be no blanket statements about the role of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust. But you can say, I think, on balance, that Pope Pius XII, the vicar of Christ on this planet, did not cover himself with glory. As for other countries, Britain does better than most. That is, England, with a population of about 48 million, took in 70,000 Jews before the war. Not a bad record. We have a country, let us say, of 140 million at the time, let's say let's say 130 million by 1940. We're not taking in a proportionate basis that many Jews. In Canada, the situation is very, very difficult. The best book on Jewish immigration to Canada in the interwar period has as its title the words of a Canadian. The best book, again, I may have misspoken, the best book on Canada, on the issue of Jewish immigration into Canada in the interwar period. That is a book, the title of which is the words of a high-ranking Canadian official. When asked, how many Jews should we take in? His famous remark is, none is too many. None is too many. Very, very difficult before the war and during the war for any Jew to get into Canada. After the war, it's a different story. On a proportionate basis, Canada has far more survivors than does the United States, on a proportionate basis. So, my friends, in this very, very difficult chapter in history, the church, again, is not doing what it should have done. Pope Pius XII, a very smart man, does not do what should have been done. And for the umpteenth time, whatever they did, they couldn't have saved 6 million Jews. Like Roosevelt, they couldn't have saved all the Jews. But what they could have done is to save tens of thousands of Jews, maybe even several 100,000 Jews. But they don't even do that. I'm sorry to end on such a sad note. I really am. The church has made it good in Vatican II. You can't bring back the dead. But in Vatican II in the early 60s, the church finally publicly repudiated the charge that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. The line of the church now, the position of the church is, this was done by the Romans. And if there was any Jewish complicity, it was by only a small number of Jews. And the idea that because a small number of Jews collaborated with the Romans in murdering Jesus, the church has specifically stated, you can't blame all of the Jews of that time. You can't blame the Jews of our time. You can't blame the Jews forever. The Romans did it. That's the argument. And historians, both Catholic as Christian as well as Jewish historians, make that point. The Romans were the ones that ran Judea. They're not going to turn over the decision of life and death to a hated and oppressed population, a conquered population. Pilate called the shots. Pilate wanted Jesus dead, in all likelihood. Remember, we're talking about a time. The only source we have are the Gospels. And the earliest Gospels were written 40 years after the death of Jesus. So what did in fact happen is the church finally in the 1960s says that if a few Jews were responsible, the Romans were primarily responsible, the Jews of that time should not be blamed, the Jews of all time should not be blamed, and the Jews of our time should not be blamed. should be blamed for the death of Jesus. This is very important into the way the Roman Catholic Church treats Jews or relates to Jews in the present period. But on balance, for the last time, this is not a glorious chapter in the history of Roman Catholicism and other Christian groups as well. So, my friends, and Jeffrey, who is also a good friend, that's it for our series. And now I'm open to any questions that you have.
Oh, you know there's going to be questions. Thank you, Professor Berk. As always, there is a lot to cover, and questions have already been coming in. Before we get to all of them, just want to remind people that this is the end of this series, but it doesn't mean it's the end of us learning together. We've got another series, as I mentioned at the beginning, starting next month, Lines in the Sand with historian Ralph Nurnberger. Professor Berk will be presenting the fourth session in that series on current events. So if you haven't done it already, please go to our website, ayala.com, and you can sign up to join us. Okay, we covered a lot tonight. FDR, of course, and Pius the 12th. Let's go back to FDR. We've got several questions that kind of deal with that period. Going to start with one from Mark Celeber, who writes in, Professor Berk, do you think President Roosevelt was ever close to authorizing bombing of the death camps or the railroad lines?
The issue of the bombing of the camps, we know that the American military discussed it. We know that. Whether Roosevelt ever got involved in those discussions, not altogether clear. Let me say to you, here's the argument for not bombing the camps. You send up 100 B-17s in what was called a milk run, where there was not much substantial German opposition. You know that 100 B-17s are not coming home. They'll run out of fuel, the fuel will be shot down, fuel will get lost, whatever it may be, accidents. American losses, air losses during the war were tremendous. For the Brits, the greatest percentage of British military men who died in the Second World War was in bomber command. Close to 60% of British pilots and crews were killed. So the idea, now this is a question, Jeffrey, that relates to our time. Can you justify the loss of men and materiel for humanitarian purposes? Bombing Auschwitz, bombing the crematoria, bombing the railroad lines, would it have shortened the war by a single minute? The answer is probably not. So could you justify the loss of men and materiel? That's a question. Look, we faced this question before in Rwanda. 800,000 people in Rwanda were killed in the 90s, those terrible massacres. We could have saved them. You put in 5,000 American, 5,000 British, 5,000 Dutch, 5,000 Germans, and it comes to an end. And the argument that some people have, we didn't intervene because these were black people. Who gives a damn about black people? That's the argument. We didn't intervene. Do you remember? I don't know if you're old enough, Jeffrey. I don't even know if you're old enough. Do you know the African-American community, long before Barack Obama, said that the first black president was Bill Clinton? He was so sympathetic to African-Americans. Do you really think that Clinton didn't intervene in Rwanda because he didn't like black people? No. What Clinton knew, if you put 5,000 American soldiers in Rwanda to stop the killing, 5,000 American soldiers are not coming back. They're just not coming back. Again, never let explication become exoneration. I think we should have intervened. That we would be true to our values. And you can make it would have been a good foreign policy success. This would surely show that the United States is a bastion of humanitarian thinking. But we didn't intervene. It's not the first time. Believe me, it's not going to be the last time. Then you come to something else. Here you got to have a little, I'll use the expression, a little rachmanus, a little pity. Some of the military people correctly say, they won't say it, I will say it, but they know in their heart of hearts it's right. Precision bombing is an oxymoron. You're going to bomb the gas chambers in the crematoria? you're going to kill a lot of inmates. And some of the military people are saying, during the war, they're saying this. When the war is over, they're going to blame the American Air Force and the Royal Air Force for killing innocent civilians. Is this a cop-out? I'm not sure. And then something else. I'm about to tell this to my students in the next week. Remember when we were children and we didn't want to do something, either in the classroom or anywhere else? And our teachers and our parents used to say, where there's a will, there's a way, right? They were right. We just didn't want to do the work, right? Lazy, we got other things to do, the gonads are jumping, whatever it may be, right? We didn't want to do that stuff. Where there's a will, there's a way, operates for evil as well. Do you think, remember, we discussed this earlier in an earlier lecture, the Holocaust by bullets. Jews were not gassed and cremated. They were just shot down. Close to 2 million of them were shot down in the German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union. Do you think that if we bombed the crematoria and the railroad tracks, the Germans would have stopped killing Jews? They would have gunned them down. We know that. Nonetheless, my own personal view is we should have bombed. We couldn't have saved most of the Jews in Auschwitz or anywhere else, but we could have saved a number of them. And again, we're talking about human beings. But don't think for a second that the bombing of the railroad lines and the crematoria and the gas chambers was a panacea. It wasn't. And one thing we learned during the war, the Germans were very, very good at repairing things. We could knock out their railroad lines. In 24 hours, the railroad lines were put back in business, largely because they used slave labor to do it. They were very good, the Germans, at this. So again, my own personal view is we should have bombed. Churchill wanted to bomb. Roosevelt, we're not clear about. But Churchill wanted Bomber Command to bomb. But Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris they used to call him, said, no, can't take away any planes from the bombing of Berlin and the bombing of German cities and the bombing of the German industrial infrastructure. So we didn't bomb. Although, when we go on the Ayala trips, when we go to Auschwitz, we go to Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II. Those are with the Stammlagers, the main camps. Less than 5 miles away from Birkenau, that's the killing field for the Jewish people, is Auschwitz III, what was called Monowitz or Buna. That's where I.G. Farben and the industrial companies set up factories using slave labor. We bombed there. It would have taken less than a minute to go from the bombing of Buna to Auschwitz II. So the argument is we couldn't send planes that far that would put them in danger. We sent planes that far, but we didn't bomb Birkenau.
All right, Professor Berk, I've got a question from Judy Winnick, who would like to know what role did Eleanor Roosevelt play in helping the Jews? Did she influence her husband in establishing the Refugee Board in 1944?
Eleanor Roosevelt was a great human being, a wonderful human being. I'm not being flippant, however, when I tell you this was not a marriage made in heaven. They were estranged. She did have contact with him, maybe estranged is too strong a word. He had a mistress. He really was disengaged from Eleanor. Eleanor couldn't move him on the issue of an anti-lynch law bill before the war. Her heart was always in the right place. But this is, I guess, what would be called realpolitik. He's not going to let his wife tell him to do things that might jeopardize his agenda, as we would say. He's not going to do it. If she were the president, things might have been very, very different. But she wasn't the president. She was the president's wife, and it wasn't a particularly good marriage. And he was the consummate politician, putting his finger always up to the wind, seeing where the winds were blowing. He's not going to squander political capital on the Jews. In a nutshell, that's what it's all about.
All right, still looking at that period, you were talking somewhat earlier about the xenophobia of the 1930s in the United States. We got a question from Dr. Alan Beck, which basically asks to draw some comparison to that period and what was happening here in the United States to what's happening today.
What can I say, Doctor? What can I say? Americans have a long, even though we are a nation of immigrants, we have a long tradition of being hostile to immigrants. And so that hostility was played out. That's played out against the background. And here again, Jeffrey. It's going to have to suck it up now here because we're getting into delicate stuff.
As you say, Professor Berk, let her rip.
Let it rip.
Yeah.
The problem was that the Democratic Party came close to endorsing open immigration. Americans at this period of time did not want what they thought was open immigration. And when you put that against the background of propaganda or statements by the Republicans that a number of these immigrants had committed terrible offenses, and when you put that, add into the mix, of course, the fear that terrorists were coming in across the border, the southern border, you're going to get a situation in the campaign where immigration was a major issue. Yeah, I'm not a political scientist, but I will tell you that you can make a case that the deciding issue here, why the Republicans won, captured both houses, and got the presidency, certainly you have to factor in as a major factor their policy towards immigration, as in contrast to the Democratic Party's policy towards immigration. It is a fact of life. It just is. You want to compare it with the period before? The answer is yes. We don't like immigrants. Now, we're not the only country. Look, in Israel, what's the expression? Aliyah. Immigration in Israel is the lifeblood of Israel. But every immigrant group that has come into Israel has faced discrimination from Israelis. Every immigrant group. When the Romanians came in, Romanian Jews came in after the war. You know what the joke in in Israel was? It's an old Israeli joke. What's the first sentence in a Romanian cookbook? Steal a chicken.
Sorry. Yes.
It's sad. It's sad. But Israel accepts the immigrants. We do not accept all of the immigrants.
There's always going to be the challenge of integration.
That's correct. It's not integration. Integration is one thing. Letting them into the country is the first step.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We actually, before we turn to some questions about Pope Pius, we actually had somebody who wrote in advance. S. Glandsrock would like to know, would you, Professor Berk, comment on the role of the Irish statesman Eamon de Valera during World War II? It's my understanding that he irritated FDR and Churchill to no end by allowing German U-boats to move freely off the Irish coast and did little to help defeat the Germans.
That is an accurate description. De Valera is the George Washington of the Irish Republic. He's a great hero for the Irish people. Would you believe that he sent a holiday greetings to Adolf Hitler on Hitler's birthday? The Irish record towards the Jews during the war and before the immigration is not a good one. And the Jews who were taken into Ireland as immigrants, children, they were not treated particularly well. The irony here is, now, today, Ireland is probably the most anti-Israeli country in Europe. It's a tragedy. It really is very sad. The Irish, is it a question of anti-Semitism, or do the Irish identify with the Palestinians? Because for the Irish, the British occupied the area, and today Israel is occupying what some people consider to be Palestinian land. That is a commonality here. The irony in all of this is, in the 1920s and the 30s, there was a real affinity between Ireland and the Zionist movement. In fact, one of the leaders of the right-wing Zionist movement, one of the leaders of the Stern Group or the Stern Gang, the future Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, when he was in the underground fighting against the British. You know what he took as a pseudonym? Michael Collins. And when a group of Sternists went in November of 1944 and assassinated a high-ranking British diplomat, Lord Moyne, the Stern group or the Stern gang said, of all, in effect, this is not their words, of all the people in the world who should understand this, the Irish should understand it, because Lord Moyne was hell on wheels dealing with the Irish. But, as we all know, and I drum it into the students, and I try to say it here, history is fluid. It's not stagnant. Things change. And sometimes they always change. Nothing remains the same. And sometimes, again, it moves in a direction that are hostile to Jews and to the state of Israel.
All right, going to move over to a few Pope questions, but before we do, a nice comment from Henry Opatut, who said, not a question, but a thank you for the program, Professor Berk, and we look forward to seeing you in Cuba. So,
That's
nice.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, and before we get into Pius questions, we had said at the beginning we were going to talk about some book recommendations. Actually, we had a couple people post some here, but did you want to talk about
Yes, David Bender, if you're Dr. Bender, if you're out there, I lost your email. That's why I didn't respond. I respond to all emails. You asked me about some books that I had mentioned in the last lecture. Sarah's Key. That's a novel, but it does a it was made into a film, a very good film, very tough film to see, because a lot of it centers on the Veldiv, the roundup in that bicycle stadium. So Sarah's Key. The book on Hungary by Randolph, I'm not sure that's his first name, Bram, B-R-A-H-A-M. He wrote a book on the genocide in Hungary, what happened to Hungarian Jews. That is far and away the best book. Then there are the books by Maris and Paxton that deal with Vichy France and Vichy France's attitude towards the Jews. And then I mentioned to you the best one-volume account of the Holocaust. There are many good one-volume accounts. The best one is by Saul Friedlander, who wrote two books. It's a set, but the book that you want is the second volume, The Years of Extermination, 1939 to 1945. That's Saul Friedlander.
Okay, a couple others, as long as we're on the topic. Betsy Frank wrote in to recommend The Last Days of Budapest by Adam Labor.
Yeah, that was reviewed, and I'm ordering it tonight. That was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. There are many good books on Budapest. There really are. Yeah. I'm not sure this is the best one, but there are some very good books on Budapest.
Yep. So Shirley Wise wrote in with a couple. The Invisible Bridge, a historic epic novel on Hungarian Jews during World War II, and Safe Haven by Ruth Gruber, about bringing 1,000 Jewish refugees to the United
States. I must also say, permit me for interjecting here, is for reasons that I'm not sure of, some of the best films on the Holocaust deal with Hungarian Jewry. So let me recommend some of them. Music Box. That's an old, probably 20, 25 years old, with Jessica Lange. That's a superb film. The best film that deals with the history of the Jews is a film called Sunshine, which takes a Jewish family, which originally I think was named Sonnenschein, takes a Jewish family through the 19th century, through the Holocaust, and into the post-World War II period. Gloomy Sunday, which is a very interesting film. Apparently there was there's a kernel of truth in this. Apparently there was a very interesting composition, musical composition, that because of its tune, some people actually committed suicide after hearing the film, after hearing the the music composition. This film is about, it's entitled Gloomy Sunday, dealing with a Jewish family and a German officer that they meet before the war, and then when the Germans take over Hungary, he shows up in their restaurant. It's a very, stay with it. It's a little slow moving in the beginning, but stay with it. It's a very good film.
Does Sunshine feature a character that was an Olympic fencer?
Yes, that is correct.
It's a good movie.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Moving along, Ken Auerbach writes in, first of all, with a book recommendation and a question related to it. The book recommendation is Europe Against the Jews, 1880 through 1945, a history of pogroms throughout Europe by Ali Gotz. And his question is, segueing into the church, was the church's silence during the Holocaust in respect to the Jews a continuation of its silence during the pogroms that swept through Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, etc., between, say, 1900 and 1930?
The silence of the church. First of all, let me say Ali Gotz is a first-rate historian. And among other things, when he talks about anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century in Germany, he says the major factor is envy. That Jews were doing so well, entering in the middle class, entering into the highest echelons of the economy, in shipping and manufacturing and a whole host of areas, that many Germans were envious of the Jews. Envy is an important factor in anti-Semitism. Now, as far as the church's silence is concerned, I tried to say in the lecture, it's a continuation of hostility towards the Jews, towards Judaism, going back to the year one, going back to the time of the emergence of Christianity. And then it is an issue of realpolitik. You remain silent, you're not getting any leadership from the Pope, and you remain silent because you don't want the Nazis to come down on you. That's always there. So it is a continuation. It is a continuation, and it is a response to the terrible pressures that were on the church and the response to the silence of the Pope. If the Pope provides leadership, more Catholics would have, more bishops would have spoken out.
You know, you spoke about earlier the encyclical on anti-Semitism that was not released because of the death of Pius the 11th. You know, history is filled with these kind of, you know, unfortunate timing. If Pius the 11th had lived longer, it might have been a different outcome or different framing for Catholics during World War II.
Sure. I mean, unfortunately, this happens in history all the time. If you believe, as I do believe, that while there are many things that shape history, class, economics, ideas, personality is very, very important in history. Very important. Take a look at our own country's history. Suppose Roosevelt had been assassinated. There was an assassination attempt against him in Miami before he became president. John Nance Garner was his vice president from Texas, not a man known for innovative views. Would we have had the New Deal? Would we have had that great leadership during the Depression and during World War II? The answer is no. Look at Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who I believe is probably the greatest American of the 20th century because he began the struggle for civil, not he didn't begin the struggle, but to dismantling segregation in our country. Suppose he had lived. Suppose he wasn't assassinated. Suppose Bobby Kennedy wasn't assassinated. Suppose JFK wasn't assassinated. Suppose Lincoln wasn't assassinated. Would American history have been very, very different? And on the other hand, why? This is for the theologians to figure out, not for me. I said before to you, 38 assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler. 38. If just one had succeeded, the history of the world and the history of other Jewish people would have been very different.
It's probably a record only broken by Fidel Castro, who just...
Yeah, Fidel, yeah. And all, it's the cigars, Jeffrey, it's the cigars.
Kept him safe.
Which we cannot bring back, Jeffrey.
Not anymore. You got to go there. You just got to go.
Well, we go, but maybe, Jeffrey, Raul is still alive. We'll try and arrange a meeting between you and Raul.
Gladly.
And enabling us to bring back cigars.
Let's see what we can do. All right, John Winiger. John. I hope you know, John, I don't mean to give you a hard time, but you post great questions. So John writes in, Pope Pius IX made Bismarck back down. Where was Pope Pius XII for Edith Stein when she, a canonized nun, wrote to him? Where was he when 2,000 Catholic priests ended up in Auschwitz? Even Pope John admitted to Hannah Arendt that the show The Deputy was true. I don't know the reference to The Deputy. I'm not sure if you do.
The Deputy is a play by Ralph. It was a play by Ralph Hochuth. That was made into a film, and I show it to the class. And believe it or not, I forgot the name of the film. It's a very, very good film. Somebody out there, Google it.
I'm sure somebody will write in. Yeah.
Somebody. I show it to the class. It's a long film. It's a 3.5-hour film. It's a docudrama, and it's based on Ralph Hochuth's play The Deputy, which is very condemnatory of Pope Pius XII. Now, John mentions Pope Pius IX. That's Pio Nonno. Not a good guy. Not a good guy, John. He's the one that publishes, under him, is called the Syllabus of Errors, ERRORS, in which socialism is an ideology and error, liberalism is an error ideology, and so on. But most important of all, he is the Pope during the Moritara affair. Now, I don't know if we ever discussed this in the lecture series. Eduardo Moritaro lived in Bologna. He's a young boy. He's an infant. It's a Jewish family. He's a Jewish infant living in a middle-class Jewish family. The family employed a young Catholic, a teenage Catholic woman, a girl, to be as a domestic. Young Eduardo, as an infant, got very, very sick. The young woman, a believing Catholic, wanting to save his soul from burning in hell, without permission from the parents, took the boy to a nearby church and had the infant baptized. Years later, when the boy was, I don't think he was even a teenager, it comes to the attention of Catholic authorities. Bologna was under the jurisdiction of the Pope, under Pio Nonno. When the church finds out that the boy is a baptized Catholic, they take the boy away from the family. The family will not see the boy until he's in his early 20s again. And when they see him, he's a Roman Catholic priest. That is a very famous incident. Really, it stimulates a great deal of Jewish activity and Jewish religious and national consciousness. He was the Pope, or that's Pio Nonno, as he was called.
All right, Professor Berk, we've reached the top of the hour. It's been a challenging program to go through together. Thank you, as always, for illuminating some very, very difficult times and subjects for all of us. I'm sure everybody out there joins me in thanking you for all that you do.
And I thank you, Jeffrey. I thank Ayelet, and I thank all of the people that have listened. Listen to me in this series, listen to me in the other series. I hope you're not all burked out. I really hope you're not. I hope I'll see you again in another series. I hope I'll see you when we go to Eastern Europe, some of you, and I hope I'll see some of you in Cuba. It's not the end of Berk yet. So, shalom uvracha, peace and a blessing to all of you. Thank you again, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Berk. I hope to see many of you on our program next month with Ralph Nurnberger and Professor Berk. You can sign up on our website, ayelet.com. And then we'll probably take a break for the summer. So join us one more series before the summer break. But wish you all well. Once again, Professor Berk, thank you so much. And shalom.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Goodbye. Goodbye and good night.